Thanks everybody. I'm excited. I think Ernie Cato was a good nod to some of my time in New Orleans that I worked as a regional archaeologist there. And I've also been with the city of St. Augustine as a city archaeologist since 2017. I was here in the early 2000s for a few years as well. So I feel like I've got some time under my belt in terms of doing a lot of urban research. And by default, just because the nature of things have sort of was thrust into a lot of hurricane recovery and heritage at risk. It wasn't a thing when I was in school, but now it definitely is. So I think we all get to think about these things now, especially if we live in coastal communities like we are in Florida. So most of y'all are probably familiar with where St. Augustine is. We're on the northeast corner of Florida. We have at least over 4,000 years of documented human habitation. We've got a lot of pre and post-contact archaeological deposits. We're probably most well known for the Spanish settlement, sort of the moniker of the nation's oldest city when it was established in 1565. But one thing I want to point out is that our city is very small landmass wise. We only encompass about 10 square miles and have about a small community, maybe our population somewhere between 14 and 15,000 people, whereas we live in a much larger county population that is very rapidly expanding. It's one of the fastest growing in Florida. And so when people think of St. Augustine, our city limits are very limited, but the community itself and people's mailing addresses, a lot of them will say St. Augustine, even though they technically don't live in our small city limits. So good things to keep in mind. We have an amazing archaeology program here in St. Augustine, and it all stems off of our Archaeological Preservation Ordinance, which is a local ordinance. It was passed in 1986. It really stemmed from a grassroots community outreach effort from different archaeologists doing research. Archaeology has been done in St. Augustine going back almost 100 years, but it was really different preservation boards and different researchers working in St. Augustine through FSU and UF that really rallied community support for archaeology. And so the right sort of crystallization and timing of the right city commission, as well as certain projects, all crystallized in the passage of our local archaeology preservation ordinance. It's pretty unique that in that it applies not only to public property, it also applies to private property, and it is built into our planning and building permit review process. So I'm a part of the planning and building department. I'm actually under the Historic Preservation Division. And so when a project comes through, the way our ordinance works is that there's going to be ground disturbance more than 3 inches and more than 100 square feet, no matter what type of project. If it is getting a permit, it has to go through archaeological review. And it also has to be in one of our 18 archaeological zones. So as you can kind of see from this map, all the different archaeological zones in our community. You can also notice how much water we're surrounded by in St. Augustine. And most of our city area is pretty low in terms of elevation. Very little elevation of the city lands are above 10 feet. So we're very low to the sea level, you could say. But with our ordinance, we get an opportunity to go in and document what is there archaeologically prior to construction or prior to impacts. It's not meant to stop construction in any way. It's just meant to buy us a little teeny bit of time to do the work. So from that, we've done about 12,000 projects in the last 38 odd years. Most of that has been Carl Halbert was the former city archaeologist. He's now retired. He was here for 27 years. For the vast majority of that time, he was one person with a cadre of amazing, awesome volunteers doing the work. And now we actually have a total of 3 of us. As MJ mentioned, all 3 are females. And in fact, my 2 other wonderful coworkers, Catherine Sims and Kate Gaines, are both here. And so they do an amazing job we have about 35 awesome volunteers that help us do all the work. We don't just do the review, we do the actual excavation as well. So we're really, really busy doing all of our work. So one thing I just wanted to touch on for those of y'all that may not be as familiar, we work in a very urban setting. So a lot of our resources are intense, deep, stratified deposits. We are recovering lots of artifacts. I think I've only dug one negative shovel test where there truly was not a single artifact in the shovel test. And I've dug, I don't even want to know how many thousands of shovel tests in the city. So we're always dealing with a robust volume of artifacts and complicated stratigraphy. We're working in all sorts of environments, underneath buildings, inside buildings. There's one of these images on the slide that is Catherine Sims working literally behind a bar. You can see all the different wine and liquor bottles. That was kind of a fun project. We're working in the middle of the streets and utilities. We've been standing in raw sewage. We work on very small lots. So our working environment is very engaged in sort of the public eye. Everyone knows what we're doing when they see us out and about. So the types of archaeology we do can be intense and complex. Here's just one example, and this is a pretty simple example, I'd like to think, of some of the complex stratigraphy that we have. You can see both the wall and then our map, how there's multiple different deposits, multiple different features. We have at least 4 or 5 layers of tabby floors. I don't know if I can bring my mouse over here that you can kind of see all these different iterations of tabby floors. These tabby floors were started in 1730. So everything underneath those tabby floors predate the 1730s. We've got well construction pits, random trash pits, all sorts of stuff, rodents, post holes, a lot of stuff. So it's very complex, very intense in terms of recordation, excavation, and the recovery. A lot of times we are finding quite a lot of artifacts. So something to kind of keep in mind when I talk about some of our archaeological questions and deposits and how we handle things. But we are faced, as many of us, with a variety of different types of heritage at risk. The most notable, because we're a coastal community, I would say, is flooding. We get flooding from a variety of things. We have, of course, storm events. We've had Hurricane Matthew, Irma, Ian. We have nor'easters, which can be almost as bad or even worse in terms of flooding than small hurricanes. We also have something called sunny day flooding, which is a result of king tides. So those are higher than normal tides where the street can just become inundated, and certain areas can when we have certain higher than normal tides, especially in the late fall into winter. And we're also, just from hot rain, we can flood pretty easily from rain. We also are dealing with sea level rise, and that's something that has led to a lot of rising water tables, which is really hampering our efforts to do our archaeological excavation and documentation. I think one other thing in terms of risk that we have that isn't necessarily brought up quite as much, but it's heat. I think more and more we've started documenting the heat index when we've been excavating, and been a little shocked at how high the heat index has been and how sustained that heat has been in the summers when we're working. And I also think, what I'm going to touch on it, is some of the impacts that are associated with hazard mitigation projects that sometimes can almost put us at odds with some resiliency measures and hazard mitigation measures when it comes to both the built environment and historic preservation, but also just increased stormwater drainage and those kinds of projects. So we're kind of struggling with how to deal with those from impacts to the archaeological record, as well as improving flooding risks in our community. So I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of the perils of the past. I think, as it's normally more the fun part, I think, when giving talks, because you always can talk about, like, hey, archaeologically, we have found all these cool things that talk about how different communities and different people in the past have been resilient and employed resilient mitigation measures. It's a tongue twister, to some of these hazards that they have faced in the past. And I think it's always great to know that, hey, we're not alone. People have always faced flooding risks and other types of hazards. But I'm going to kind of broad brush for the sake of time over those. But there's kind of two main points that I want to make about these is that I wanted to highlight some of the strategies residents in the past have used to sort of combat and adapt to natural hazards, but more important for us as archaeologists and preservationists is to illustrate how archaeology can become relevant to society today, like how by examining the archaeological record, how we can learn about what past responses people did to adapt to these climate changes and sort of then look at what worked and what didn't, and I think that's a really important point to make when we're trying to make the point of how relevant archaeology is to today's societies. So one of the things we've documented numerous times in terms of in the archaeological record is historic future flooding. We've seen a lot of elevation that people have done in the past where they've elevated historic floors. You can see several iterations in these slides of fill deposits and then a new tabby floor that has been implemented. And so that's just a real basic way that people have adapted in terms of just elevating slightly their floors because they didn't always necessarily elevate their structures. Other mitigation measures that we have documented in numerous locations is seawalls. We're a bayfront community. We have some property on sort of northern tip of one of our barrier islands, but by and large, what you think of this historic downtown, historic St. Augustine community is actually on the bayfront. So it's not on a barrier island, but it is inland. But we do open up to a huge Matanzas Bay. So we have found evidence of different seawalls, both made out of coquina, which is a naturally occurring stone. It's our only natural rock, so to speak, that we have. So here's one work that we were doing in the street where we documented a seawall. There's also been wooden seawalls that have been documented. Several of these have not been found in the historical records, so it kind of shows different mitigation measures that individuals were employing at their own properties. One of the major seawall projects that began was right after the construction of the Castillo de San Marcos, which is our large coquina fort in St. Augustine. And you can see that on the slide over here with the sort of triangular, or not triangular shape, sort of diamond shaped fort that the Spanish built. It was completed in the 1690s. And as soon as it was completed, the Spanish started building a seawall, which you can kind of see running along this bayfront right here. And that seawall was really petitioned by the community residents. They were willing to donate their own money to construct the seawall because they really needed to combat the erosion that was happening along the bayfront. In fact, we've been able to document a lot of historic erosion of our earliest part of our community. So in the 1700s, they were talking about historic erosion to the areas that was originally part of the 16th century community. So a lot of those deposits we have lost to historic erosion. One of the things we documented archaeologically was a community dump and landfilling event behind this seawall. We've used a lot of archaeological documentation and the artifacts that we've recovered, and you can see some of these illustrated in the slide, is that there has been multiple dumping episodes. It was a community dump that we can date to almost specifically to around 1700, right after the seawall was completed, and including an entire donkey skeleton and a lot of other historic deposits, just chocked full of artifacts. So that is one thing that the community was doing. And as a result, that really led to rapid urbanization and intensive rebuilding episodes. So as I was showing you in the first slide, with all of the dumping, community dumping and landfilling, what happens shortly after that is a large part of town is now building along the bayfront. Now that the seawall is secured, it really revitalizes this part of the community and results in a lot of urban intensification as well as commercialization of bayfront properties. And so you can see, I've got this great picture of Robbie Boggs and MJ doing a rapid response to, I guess, our archaeology trowel out in the sky where we're like, we need help. And they came out and did some photogrammetry of some of these foundations to some of these structures that we had that were along the bayfront. And you can kind of see, I don't know if you can see my arrow or not, my mouse floating around. Can anybody see that? Um, for these are some of the original foundations that we found for some of these structures located right along the bayfront. So it's kind of interesting to see how this seawall sort of really protected the community and revitalized efforts. And we're talking in the early 1700s. So keep that in mind because we're going to return to that in a little bit. Another effort for the seawall construction was further along the south part of the historic community. That part wasn't originally protected by a seawall. And so when the Americans took over in the early 1800s, that part of the community was really getting scoured out. And they wanted a seawall as well. So they petitioned the now American government to build an extension of the seawall, of which I have a little inset here that shows where that seawall was built. And you can see from this historic image, sort of the area that is shown. It has the original bayfront land, and then you can see the area that was very swampy and where that area has would be eventually reclaimed with historic dumping. A lot of historic dumping was happening, and we've documented that numerous times in the archaeological record um, of all those landfilling events. So with that said, moving on a little bit more, I'm going to talk about our current perils that we have and how that is threatening our understanding and ability to understand and document the past. One of our threats is tourism and development. As I mentioned, we have a very small town of about 14,000 residents, but we receive over 6 million visitors annually. Over half of those are specifically come to St. Augustine just to engage in heritage tourism. We also have the beaches, but most people, or a vast majority of people, say that they are coming not for the beaches, but very specifically to engage with our community's heritage. We've done some great documentation of what impacts economically our heritage tourism industry has, and we've been able to place that as a $3 billion economic impact. And I think that is really critical. It helps us make arguments of how important preserving our heritage is in terms of economic value to our community. But along with that comes a lot more development pressure because we're getting so many more hotels and restaurants and more development, especially in our colonial National Historic Landmark downtown. So we're constantly trying to balance that, as it's an asset, but people are coming here, and that is great, but that also can have an adverse impact. Some of our, oops, sorry, I skipped real quick. Some of the other threats that we have, flooding, as I mentioned, is something that is incredibly common in our community, and it's probably the #1 thing that residents are very concerned about when it comes to protecting their own property, and both commercial and residential. You can tell even this was some of the flooding impacts from a tropical storm back in 2001. And you can see the flooding over part of his 1840s historic seawall that I was discussing. And as a result, just recently in the last 10 years, the city has expanded that seawall. They have used it to protect the original historic seawall and outward, built a higher seawall to protect the community. But that was all done around 2014, and soon in 2016 and 2017, we had two more back-to-back hurricanes that affected the community. And this seawall, while it has helped in some capacity, it has not provided quite the preventative measures that the community really was hoping for. One of the other things that the community has really been doing to combat all of our flooding issues is elevation. We're having lots of elevations of historic homes along the bayfront and all over town. In so many of our different neighborhoods, everyone is looking at elevating or has already elevated their property. Some of the other things to combat sort of stormwaters is stormwater infrastructure, and this is sort of both a blessing and a curse, I think, to archaeology. And I've seen it not only here, but also it was something that was happening in New Orleans quite a bit, is requiring stormwater retention, both on site and increasing capacity for stormwater retention at a municipal level. So we've been doing quite a lot of these stormwater retention projects, and it's a little shocking at how much excavation has to happen because water has to go somewhere and it's always going to go to the lowest point. So everyone wants to dig to retain that water. And in essence, it's always going to affect the archaeological record. So these are just some of examples of some of the street work that we've done when it comes to stormwater retention. And I want to kind of raise the flag of thinking of how we should deal with these, because I think they're constantly being wanted, or the community is constantly in a low-lying area wanting more stormwater retention projects. Some other types of stormwater retention that we've gotten are these, they're basically underground retention ponds. So you don't see them, but when they're being put in, they're quite shocking. They're the capacity of multiple swimming pools. In fact, some of my first couple months on the job was these large stormwater retention projects that are happening in Colonial downtown. That, I mean, this is a stone's throw away. You can't see it from all the buildings, but the Castillo de San Marcos is basically on the other side of several of these buildings. And they were just impacting lots of colonial deposits, well construction pits, post holes. They may be kind of hard to make out because they're impacting into the historic groundwater right here, but like this is a very large well construction pit that dates to the 1700s. So they can be very damaging if we're not properly planning for them when it comes to archaeological resources. Another thing in terms of our heritage at risk is sea level rise. There's quite an extensive projection for impacts to our sea level in St. Augustine based off of a lot of NOAA calculations. And it's a little alarming when we start thinking about it. There just really no other way to address it. I think I've seen over the last, from empirical evidence over the last 20 years, from doing archaeology around circa 2000 to doing it today, how much I've observed the water table and how much it has risen in the past, in those past 20 years. I have this great illustration that kind of shows the projections of sea level rise from, this was in 2022, that was done by the University of Florida's Preservation Institute in St. Augustine, showing sort of the bayfront and the sea level rise projections from 2050 all the way to 2100. And you can see how rapidly the water table is going to start to rise if those projections hold true. It's also going to inundate over 60% of our archaeological sites are subject to tidal flooding, and a 1.5-foot rise in sea level, which is really projected somewhere around 2040, is going to impact all of our archaeological zones, all of those 18 archaeological zones that I was talking about in in one of my first slides. So I want you to kind of focus on this particular slide, because this is where I'm going to bring back the relevance of what we've learned about the past and past mitigation measures. In my next slide, the viewpoint that I was showing you is from sort of the angle on, I guess it would be your left-hand side where I have that arrow. And it showed in that projections GIF that I had where the historic seawall, you can see the historic seawall in that GIF right along the bayfront. So then I take this historic map from the 1840s that has the blue line that shows where that historic seawall was. And the block that you were looking at as a view did not exist in 1840. That was all land reclamation. That was all filling behind the seawall. And then those historic houses were built. And now those historic houses are being elevated because they are at risk for flooding and have flooded numerous times. So the point is, the construction of the historic seawall in the 1840s had a very wonderful effect on mitigating the hazards of flooding events. However, it encouraged people, it created more land and it encouraged people to build closer to the water, right? So we get a lot of historic houses that date to the 1850s up until 1900 built on that property. That red block that I'm showing you on this historic map is that land that was built upon. And I'll even go back. So all of those buildings that you're seeing, the Cedar Shake buildings, all these buildings along the bayfront were built on reclaimed property and now are being threatened by sea level rise. So I think it's a very important point that I've been making over and over again to several folks working in resiliency in St. Augustine is that the seawall worked and it helped mitigate a lot of the hazards, especially flooding hazards that were there at the time, but they were solutions that were only solutions in the short term. They actually encouraged more risky behavior by building closer to the water. And now these are multi-million-dollar houses. And now we're having to create new mitigation measures to protect these properties. In fact, this historic seawall, which you can see in this image, we just rebuilt an addition to that in 2014. And now we are in another phase where we're working on elevating and building higher that seawall, even after 10 years. The city is working on a new project that's going to get started probably in the next year. So I think that's a good lesson in what we can learn from the past, especially what information we can garner from studying archaeology and what we can say that we can contribute as archaeologists to understanding past human adaptation and what lessons we can learn from that past human adaptation. So, and again, here I'm just showing you that red area that you see, that was where all those historic houses are located. So some of the other things that have deeply concerned me is with sea level rise is our water table fluctuations. I've got an example of just one excavation unit at a neighborhood called Lincolnville, where we have this historic 18th century Native American refugee mission called Pocatelaka. You can, in one of the first slide, there's an agricultural ditch that we documented. And in our work within 1 week, it rained. You can see our excavation unit with all the rain droplets and how the water, the rainwater came. And then the next day, because it not only rained, but it also caused a rise in the overall water table, how much higher the water table got. And luckily, we completed excavating this particular unit, but other units we had at that property, we could no longer excavate them because of the rising water table. And so we had abandoned our documentation of that site. And unfortunately, we just did not get to document all the features that were there. And now a house was built on top of that project. So it's one of the things that we're really struggling with in terms of how to deal with the water table fluctuations and how we are abandoning about 5 to 6 projects annually because of the rising water table. They're just deposits we cannot get to because we have no way to pump the water table down. So it's really affecting our ability to document several of the sites that we're interested in documenting. Some of our community responses, especially at the city level, we've been very proactive. We have a wonderful historic preservation division, and we also have a wonderful a chief resiliency officer, Jessica Beach, who's been doing so many wonderful things at helping our community respond to a lot of these hazards, mainly flooding, I think, because that's the big thrust of what the community response really wants to be focused on. But we've done updated our coastal vulnerability assessment. We did one back in 2016, and we just updated another one at the end of last year. We did a historic preservation master plan in 2018. When I came aboard, I was able, kind of at the tail end of the entire process, able to tweak a couple things. And so that's a great resource. Our former historic preservation officer, Jenny Wolf, did a resilient heritage in the nation's oldest city. It was a grant through the Florida Department of Historical Resources, and it was a great project that we were able to look at different resiliency measures, both for the built environment and also for archaeological resources. And then we had started a groundwater monitoring project through grant funding, but then the grant was unfortunately pulled where we were going to install groundwater monitoring wells, and really start gathering some data on how much the water table is fluctuating and the salinity and what areas we were seeing fluctuation. And this was part of a much larger citywide resiliency grant. So I was kind of piggybacking onto this because I really want some more solid data to understand how much the water table is fluctuating, especially if artifacts are getting wet, dry, and how much are we potentially losing, as well as where the water table is fluctuating and how fast is it rising overall on the average. So maybe we can talk about that. It's one project that I really want to implement because without that data, it makes it hard to really just say, well, I see that the water table is rising. I want to be able to say, here's data points to say that over the last 5 years, the average water table, due to sea level rise is X. So hopefully we'll be able to work on something toward that. Couple other things, as I mentioned, the nation resilient heritage in the nation's oldest city. We had an archaeological component. We had an archaeologist, Chris Newman from ACI Archaeological Consultants, as part of that assessment team. And working with us, we came up with several different strategies to kind of combat some of our heritage at risk. One of them was really prioritizing the proper archaeological documentation. It used to be, I was a big proponent of preservation in place. If we can avoid and minimize impact, that was the ultimate goal. Now, even with sea level rise, I feel that that is not the case anymore. So we really need to prioritize what we're documenting because we're losing it either to development and or sea level rise. And if we're going to document it, really make sure we do it and do it in the right way, and do not to say that most archaeologists don't document stuff. That's all part of the archaeological process, but that we selectively pick what we're doing and we do it with the right intent on what deposits we're going to document. Another thing is prioritize curation. I've argued that we have the best control over what happens to the artifacts and the whole collection, as well as all the documentation that go with it, more than we can control what is happening to a site when it's in the ground. So, since we already have a vast collection, 35 years of archaeological research, we can better control what happens to that collection. So we need to prioritize the curation of that collection, the long-term curation, and all of the digitizing all the records, putting them in databases, making those collections accessible, and really thinking about what environment we're keeping those curation, in terms of a curation facility. We really need to be thinking and prioritizing the um, best type of construction, and we're working on a new lab development or developing a new lab facility right now. So those are things, not just keeping them originally, we would do the best with what we had, right? So a lot of times we didn't have the right curation boxes and rehousing and that kind of stuff, but now we're really focusing. That's one of our big focuses, is really digitizing that collection and prioritizing our curation. Another thing was integrating GIS. When I started, there was no maps of where any of the archaeology work had been done in St. Augustine, which sounds pretty shocking, but I'm a big proponent of GIS, and so are my coworkers. So we were able to get another Florida Division of Historical Resources grant to digitize where all of our projects were, as well as georeference historical maps, and bring in another additional environmental data so that we can make more rapid, better informed decisions on what projects to prioritize and what deposits we need to document and salvage before they're impacted, as well as having better records of where everything is and being able to make quick decisions on things. So that has been a really good, important thing that we've done. I know it sounds sort of basic, but until recently, we did not have this data readily accessible. Some of the other suggestions that we've been doing as a community is really staying engaged. We're fortunate to work in a small municipal government, so we can more easily talk to different folks. So when they're planning resiliency projects, we're very much a part of that conversation, which I think is very important. It also involves me poking and prodding when, like, hey, I hear there's the new utility project coming up, and I have some archaeological concerns about that if the city's going to be working on that. Or, hey, I hear as part of a community redevelopment project, you're going to be undergrounding utilities. Well, let's get ahead of the game. And while you're in the design phase, let's talk about the archaeological resources and what potential impacts we can have. And we can work together to minimize or mitigate some of those impacts. And that has been a good solution. It's not perfect, but it has really resulted in some better outcomes versus here's a project, we're doing it, we've already designed it, we have 100% construction documents, and we're going to start tomorrow. So that has really helped us. Another thing is we've really rallied our community support. Our community is very pro preservation, and that has been great. And so we've been able to sort of engage with preservation partners and sort of leverage different community support for the importance of archaeology and as well as the built environment. And I think that's been a really great outcome of our Resilient Heritage grant is that we've been able to really put a value number on what economic impact historic preservation and heritage tourism has to the community. And because of that, when we've done vulnerability assessments, we've been able to say, hey, our historic resources and our archaeological sites are critical assets to the community, right? If we do not have those, we cannot bring back the tourism industry, and that people are not going to come to our city. And so that economic impact is just as important as restoring hospitals and sewage treatment plants and other things. So in our last vulnerability assessment we just completed at the end of last year, historic preservation was and historical resources, those resources were ranked as critical assets. So I think that that's really important in terms of being a part of the conversation when it comes to resiliency planning measures. So can't say that it's not a hard challenge, but it's a very important one to stay engaged. And I think that kind of sums up, I've probably talked for way too long, but that kind of sums up at least a very broad brush thing that we've been doing. I'm going to post a couple of links in the website, in the chat in a minute, but I definitely just wanted to thank many folks that have helped us, especially our archaeologists, our staff archaeologists and volunteers, as well as our preservation partners. I did not get to say enough how wonderful FPAN is, and they have helped us countless times. And so I really want to thank Sarah and MJ for inviting me to share with y'all some of the things we're doing here.